Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Financial Literacy Fireside Chat series hosted by the Edmonton Global Shapers community. This is part 5 of our 5-part series, where the 3 of us, well, now the 4 of us on the call here, will talk about various personal finance topics. And with us today is Jon Dziadyk from the City of Edmonton Councillor. How are you doing, sir?
Good. Thank you for having me here.
Awesome. So Jon is joining myself, Alex Namath, Nicholas Menon, and Joel Shackleton here today to talk about various questions relating to the city budget. And we figured this is a relevant discussion because it's conversation and questions about a budget. And that is relevant for whatever kind of budget you're looking at, whether it's a personal budget or talking about the City of Edmonton budget. So with that, we can get started here. So I've got a list of questions for you here, Jon, and maybe the 3 of us will take turns grilling you on the City of Edmonton budget.
Sounds good. Bring it on. And first, I want to say Global Shapers sounds like an amazing organization, and I'm really excited that you're taking Financial Literacy Month seriously and trying to spread more awareness of how financial decisions impact us all. It's really quite important.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. No, thanks for that. All right. So maybe the first thing, Jon, maybe we can discuss some of the high-level elements of a city budget. Maybe just some the different sections of a city budget and what are those? What does that look like?
Sure, absolutely. So the City of Edmonton is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and it is actually quite structured like a corporation. So that's different than other levels of government. Our budget, depending on how you measure it, and over the years, typically I say it's about a $7 to $8 billion budget. We have an operating budget and a capital budget and a utilities budget, but the operating and capital budgets are similar to what other organizations go through. Operating is for your day-to-day expenses, paying salaries, and capital budget, which is something we sometimes borrow money for. So cities can go into debt, but I can get into that in more detail later. But sometimes we want to borrow money now so that we can purchase things now and not wait until we have all the money to pay for them. So you'll see that sometimes with LRT or large rec centers. But in the end of the day, it's just a really large budget. We have 76 lines of business within the city. So everything from waste removal, we pay for police services, new roads, you name it, public transit, the planning and development permits. There's a lot of stuff that we budget for. And I know there will be follow-up questions, so I can get into the details as required.
Right, and you're right. I didn't specify it at the beginning, but I mean, operating versus capital budget, those are 2 very different things. We can certainly dive into both. I guess the questions I've got in front of me here, they do more center around an operating budget, but through the questions, and we can certainly shift over and make some references to the capital budget as well.
Sounds good. Well, let me just elaborate a bit more on the operating budget. So we do set our budgets over 4-year periods of time. So currently we're in the 2018 to 2021, or is it 2022 budget? Sorry about that. There's an election in the year 2021. So we project over a 4-year period, and then we make annual adjustments as required. Because of COVID right now, we've had to revisit our 4-year budget more than we normally would. The way that we pay for city services is a combination of a heavy reliance on property taxes and transfers from other governments, which don't always occur to the way we expect. So there's a bit of volatility there, and user fees. So if you get on the bus and you pay a fare, you're paying for part of the cost of that bus service. If you go to a rec center and you're paying an admittance fee, you're paying for part of covering that service. On the operating side, we do make our books whole for the most part. So we actually conveniently raise as much property tax as required, factoring in the user fees and other transfers so that we can square it off, which is why property taxes, our chief way of raising money, do fluctuate every year. And the public is very sensitive to fluctuation. So we try and keep it as low as possible. But for example, other levels of government with income taxes, it's sort of the rate stays the same year over year with adjustments every once in a while. Here with the City of Edmonton, we have to make it whole every year.
So this may actually lead well into the second question that we have, and that's around, I guess both in terms of, the 4-year cycles, but also when you revisit the budget annually, how are decisions prioritized when it comes to, allocating the funds and deciding what expenses are most necessary?
I'm an elected city councillor, which means I'm not an expert in budgeting or finance, but all councillors and the mayor bring something different to the table. City council is analogous in some ways to a board of directors in a corporation, and we have our city administration, which is similar to the management. So our city manager could be seen as a CEO, and we have our chief financial officer as well. So city administration takes direction from council through the policies that we set. And of course, we also control the budget, but we say what type of tax rate we think would be tolerable while recognizing that a growing city has demands and we have to pay for things. We set policy and we set expectations, and then the city administration comes back with a proposal. For the most part, what they bring back is based on priorities and in alignment with our strategic plans. Any kind of organization, any large organization should really have all the financial decisions come in and align with past strategic decisions made. So, but it's a big organization and it's not perfect. And then add the element of politics. And that's where it gets much different at the municipal level. We have a very low tolerance right now for any property tax increases. And again, paying for things for a growing city, sometimes you need that. We also want to be a city that attracts new people and businesses to come here. And therefore, we need something nice to show off for the city. So from a city building perspective, there's always a desire to do more to attract more people. But it's not always the most prudent to do some of these decisions with scarce resources. The political element is that each councillor wants to be seen as fighting for their constituents and advancing projects that would help out the people that they represent. But it could be a race to the bottom in the sense of a lot of spending. If I want a dog park in Ward 3 and someone else wants a road widening over here, and then someone else wants, whatever over there. And meanwhile, we're all trying to support local businesses and issuing grants ourselves so that people shop local and all that stuff. There's can be a lot of competing issues, and we need a lot of fiscal discipline, and the political element doesn't help it too much. Now, increasingly, we're moving towards something called priority-based budgeting. It hasn't been fully implemented. Hopefully, though, as the name implies, just looking at priorities, that might shave off some of the political considerations, so just the best decisions for the city are made as a whole. And again, we look at it every year just to make sure that we're aligned with the current realities.
So that just so happens to lead fairly well into my question, which is around the more popular or contentious issues related to our current city budget. You, in your past answer, just alluded to city building and representing your ward. Is it sometimes difficult to balance those two things? And then in addition to that, which items, at least most recently, have been the most contentious in our most recent budget?
It's a good question, and I did reference how a ward councillor would want stuff for their local area, but I think the more that we view the city as a whole as something that we're all responsible for, the more we can mitigate against some of those concerns, but they're still ever present. But for example, what I mean, downtown should belong to everyone. Other central areas like White Avenue and Old Strathcona should be viewed as citywide assets. But I can understand in my neck of the woods in North Edmonton, other councillors might not be even aware of what's happening in the sense of, road pressures on certain roadways and pressures on other localized infrastructure. So part of my job is to bring awareness to what's going on. Okay, and I'm just trying to think of the second part of that question. Sorry, Joel, what parts have I not touched on about?
So what I'm happy that you touched on the difficulties that you might find between what's important to the entire city and what might only be important to your individual wards. But inside the budget, I can't imagine that every topic is as contentious as others in each year. I can assume that most recently the transportation tends to be something that is a hot topic. And then also you have to then balance that with the reality that we need to see city building and city growth in order to continue to expand our actual budget to improve the city itself. So I was curious, currently, what are those contentious issues, and would some of them surprise us?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. And that's really a political question in many ways too. If you take LRT expansion, for example, that really hits on city building. And it's hard to imagine a modern city where you'd want to go to as a tourist or perhaps to do business that wouldn't have an advanced rapid transit network. In Edmonton, we've always done LRT, which is surface rail. Other cities have underground subways. Underground is so much more expensive. I know two of you are engineers. And you know just how expensive that is. When you start digging, you have to reinforce it, relocate utilities. It's so much more money. But then, so we've decided to do LRT, and there's desires to do more LRT. But some would just say maybe we should just have better and more frequent bus service. Or what if we had tandem buses all connected that ran like an LRT but just drove on the surface? And with new technology, perhaps you could have it always be a green light when this sort of a bus rapid transit vehicle would be going by. So that sounds good. So, but we've invested so heavily in the LRT. So sometimes decisions are, well, should we be modernizing it and changing that around? Are there going to be driverless vehicles? How can we build a city to accommodate all of this? So that's one example with public transit. But because of the desire, perhaps, for a bit of controversy, I'll state the things that I come across a lot. So people are really against photo radar, but it actually funds a lot of our traffic safety initiatives. A lot of people are against public art because it can be quite expensive and it adds to the cost of municipal buildings and other structures. But a lot of the public enjoys public art. People want taxes to keep going down. People want the roads and core services to be looked after, but people also want to attract people to a city that thinks more about than just like repairing roads and has a bit more vision. The gondola proposal, that could be one way of bridging the gap across the river valley. That's controversial, one, because it's development in the river valley, and two, because some people just don't take it seriously as a project, even though other cities have had successful gondola projects to get across irregular terrain and rivers. So that's something. But then you look at the funicular that was largely constructed out of grant money from other levels of government. And the location has been criticized as being not that appealing to many Edmontonians, so it's not that well used. So then if you're talking about something like a gondola, well, everyone's going to compare it to the funicular that has had less than ideal success. But back to development in the river valley, that's always controversial because we have such a picturesque river valley, largest urban park in the world. And EPCOR just recently, you might have noticed or heard that they proposed to do a solar farm development in the river valley. And that involved the mowing, like some trees would have to be displaced and it's industrial development in the river valley. So some people saw that as very visionary and great, that we're kind of trying to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, but other people really critiqued the location. And while that was proposed by EPCOR, City Council approved it based on the land use of the zoning. Almost all decisions are going to be met with levels of skepticism and criticism. You just have to have thick skin if you're a politician. That's what I've learned.
That's very interesting, John. It's very interesting insight. I wasn't aware of some of the things that you mentioned there. I guess I was thinking back to when you were mentioning how, things like property tax, obviously, people don't want property taxes to go up every year. But it's essential for revenue generation within the city. I guess what would you say is the most volatile component of that revenue section of the City of Edmonton's income side of things?
Well, property tax is reliable because we adjust the rates every year, but a lot of people, there's not clarity about how the system works. So ultimately, property tax is a tax on wealth. And if you have whatever house and you improve the basement, you're paying more because the basement's been improved, or you do fancy landscaping. We use a system of mass appraisal, so you should be paying similar to what other neighbors have based on similar square footage. But it's a really antiquated system that even almost dates back to feudal times with the taxing of property as wealth. So it's not a perfect system, and you don't get more city services in relation to the amount of tax you pay, and that's fine. That's what we've all bought into. But those $1 million houses that you might see in certain parts of the city, they still only get their garbage picked up once a week. They still have similar bus service based on the demand for that. So it's not that volatile, but there's are questions that people ask. So I feel that I'm going to answer the spirit of your question with this. Since it's based on the property values, if during a pandemic all the houses in Edmonton go down by 5%, say for example, people would think that the property taxes would go down by 5%, but that's not the way the system works, because we still generate the amount of money that's required. So back to, I'm glad that it's Financial Literacy Month and we're talking about this. People often incorrectly make the assumption that they'll pay less in tax if their house goes down in value, but it really matters what's happening across the whole city. We also rely on other government transfers, and often for our larger capital projects, and that's subject to the will of the provincial government. And we've had some impacts there that we weren't expecting when the government changed over recently.
Right. So I guess maybe a little bit of an extension. So would property taxes almost be like a backwards calculated number then, based on the revenue that the city of Edmonton needs?
Yeah, I mean, you could reverse engineer it to see how we got to the number. And there's different financing mechanisms where like sometimes we only purchase stuff or use it for operating if we have the money in the moment, or there's other ways of there's other financial techniques, which I'm not an expert in, that we can deal with it. But in the end, cities don't, something I was saying before, we don't run debt on operating, and we try not to do much on capital. But of course, being a large organization, we do have millions and millions of dollars in debt. But basically, we'll get what we can through our projections and property taxes. So that's why we revisit our 4-year operating budget every year, actually a few times a year, in order to make sure that we're going to be collecting what's actually needed.
In a way, running debt to fund operating expenses would be the equivalent of someone taking out credit card debt to pay for their groceries, I guess, which is not fiscally sound. Yeah,
that's not fiscally sound. Well, on a technicality, I would say, again, we're not going into debt on operating, but to the spirit of the question, we do that with capital. And I would rather use the analogy of a mortgage for a house. If you have a family of 4 and you require a house now, but you know it's going to take 30 years to pay for it, well, if you wait 30 years, your kids are going to have grown up and then you don't need that house anymore. So you borrow the money now to enjoy it in the moment, and use it when it's needed. So we adopt that philosophy a bit. And shoot, I'm bad with remembering the questions, because I had another point. If you could just repeat that, there's another point I was going to make.
No problem. Yeah, it was just on volatility of different streams of revenue.
Yeah. And Nicholas's follow-up question, what was that again? Sorry.
I was just trying to make a comparison to the person.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. The point I was going to make, actually, so we have a decent credit rating, and sometimes, though, recently it's been dropped, but that doesn't impact our ability to borrow, because we actually have preferential borrowing, which is done through the province's their credit rating and their access to financial markets. So all I wanted to say is it's easier and cheaper for the city of Edmonton to borrow money to finance current decisions than it would be for someone, a regular resident. And just because you use the analogy of a credit card for groceries, and we all think of those really high interest rate on credit cards. I didn't want to leave the impression that the city of Edmonton is sometimes buying things as if it were a credit card. Although not putting words in your mouth, I just wanted to make that clear.
Right. Yeah. And when it comes to interest rates, historically low interest rates, it of course makes sense to borrow for capital improvements.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess maybe on the flip side of what Alex had asked, what would you say are the most volatile components of expenses the city has? And just off the top of my mind, things that I think many would think of are things like snow clearing and road repairs.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you brought up snow clearing, because I might not have thought of that example, but it's probably one of the most accurate one. And even including considerations of climate change and flooding. But these, historically, we haven't always had the same challenges with these environmental episodic events, such as, every time it snows significantly in Edmonton, I think it costs, I don't really want to throw out a number, but I think it's about $10 million to clear the roads. So I'll throw out a number because that's better content for your video. We hire a lot of private contractors every time it snows. The city doesn't have all the capacity in-house with our snow blow, with our plows and all that. So in a winter, if it snows, and what I can say is our total snow clearing budget's around $60 million a winter. So you can think, you didn't ask this, but other cities, say in the States where it's warm year round, they don't incur that type of expense. And then they also don't need the same level of asphalt that we have here with freeze thaw. We get a lot of potholes. So a warmer climate means different things. But for us, the question is, what does a changing climate mean? And it's quite volatile when, you might just have a few major snow dumps in one year, and then the next year you might not have budgeted for it. But citizens demand and expect snow clearing to occur. And if you're having 10 or 12 major snow events, that's actually quite hard to budget for.
Thanks.
So in that same vein, I kind of want to, I'm going to skip over my specific question because we can probably touch on this a little later, but I kind of want to go back to that interest rate conversation where when I look at the 2020 expenditure budget, it says that debt repayment is 10.1% of the 3.2 or $0.2 billion. Now, Nick had mentioned that it's important to, or you had mentioned that it's important to look at our budget in the same way that you look at a mortgage. But I tend to look at the city of Edmonton in an even different sense, in that its lifespan isn't finite, or it doesn't have a stop date like ours does. I might die when I'm 90 years old. The city of Edmonton outlasts us all. And given that reality, it doesn't make a ton of sense for us to look at debt in the same way. Because if this city is around forever, these things aren't something that need to be paid off in 30 years. We should be probably operating at a slight leverage point. So is that considered in our current budget? And how does the unpredictable interest rate environment kind of affect our city budget? Is it very difficult to have a conversation around this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think of cities as living sort of creatures, but without an expiry date. So I like your analogy. I would say, though, that we build for new growth and we expect revenues from new growth. And historically in Alberta, we're a younger province and the city of Edmonton's a younger city. And then we can see with the numbers of kids, what kind of impact that has on schools. But again, that's provincial responsibility, but accommodating schools and neighborhoods and the like has impacts. And then on the types of activities we offer. And then we have a younger workforce, and perhaps they want certain amenities like bike lanes downtown if there's sort of a cluster of businesses that want something like that. So, but now with the current economic situation and the situation in Alberta as a whole, there's less people coming here and there's some people leaving. So cities, while they don't die per se, but there are cities that have kind of shriveled to nothing. We have to make sure that the city continues to be in a healthy position, and people will move based on their financial circumstances. And if you have, say, roots in Edmonton and you wouldn't consider picking up and leaving for Silicon Valley or somewhere else, you might consider going to Stony Plain, Sherwood Park, or St. Albert if their taxes are lower. So there's competition amongst cities, even though we're completely static geographically. There's certain appeal for the city as a region. Through our economic development initiatives, we try and attract businesses here. But if we went completely bust on that front, people would be leaving Edmonton. And then, and if they were leaving because we spend too much money now and their kids couldn't afford it, sort of to just use that cliche, then that could be problematic for the health of the city. So we want to be mindful of that. In terms of the interest rates fluctuating, again, we get preferred borrowing through the cities, through the provinces, through special arrangements with the provinces, which is based on their financial health. In terms of the way the Bank of Canada is changing interest rates, that's not my level of expertise. But when councillors ask city administration for information on how much projects will cost, and if we're talking about large capital projects, we always look at the operating costs with that. Typically, the city of Edmonton pays employees more so than the private sector does for, say, jobs like lifeguards and custodians and stuff like that, which is fine. That's an intentional decision. But we project in the future the operating costs of capital and all that, but it's quantified in a way from our accountants and such, so that we can make relevant political decisions now with all that information in current dollars, more or less. So there's people I lean on for the answers to that. But they're watching the financial markets. We also have a lot of money invested in the financial markets, and that's one of our financing tools, is to rely on that money from time to time in different reserve accounts. I hope that answered your question, Joel.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to kind of give more context to and color, but generally speaking, I kind of want to ask a follow-up though, in regards to, you mentioned that you guys have reserves and they're invested. How are they invested?
We have a whole financial investments committee that's made up not by politicians, but made up by experts, different prominent figures in Edmonton that are in the financial industry. They make recommendations on where we put money. But I'll give you a tangible example. We have something called the EdTel Endowment Fund, which when Edmonton owned Edmonton Telephones, and we decided to sell it, and we made, I forget how many hundreds of $1 million at the time, instead of using that for current spending or for a rainy day spending, it was decided that this endowment fund would just be invested, and we would then have the annual amount of interest paid, which is in the millions of dollars, which is great. Another example, but it's different, is the city of Edmonton owns EPCOR. EPCOR is a multi-billion-dollar company, and they have operations with water and electricity elsewhere beyond Alberta. There's a lot of operations in Arizona and Texas, and we're the sole shareholder, and they provide a very healthy dividend to the city of Edmonton every year, over $100 million a year. So it's great that we have this Edmonton success story of EPCOR, and it's great that they do a good job, and we get that large dividend, which allows us to spend money, which otherwise would be likely accrued through property tax. So, I mean, honestly, for the question was more about detailed investments and how that's taken care of. I can see some hesitation why would the city of Edmonton, that has its responsibilities with clearing, like with sidewalks and roads and this and that, to be investing money, like shouldn't that money just remain in the pockets of Edmontonians? But a lot of this money has either come from surpluses or certain rainy day funds that have been invested, where there's a guarantee pretty much of over 10% return. So it's not volatile. They're all safe investments, and a lot of it's based on the leveraging that we have with our unique financial position, being people trust the city of Edmonton, we get preferred rates, and again the relationship with the province, and just some historical decisions around owning EPCOR and the EdTel Endowment Fund.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually see that as a negative at all. I I think that makes complete sense that the city of Edmonton has something like that. And maybe just on a related note, you know, speaking to, you know, the city of Edmonton having preferential rates to the province. I'm just curious, John, if you could speak to it all, like how, you know, having the provincial credit rating downgraded last year, or just even in recent years due to the oil and gas economy, how has that impacted the city's ability to borrow money?
It's likely impacted our ability to borrow at the same rates, but not to borrow in general. I'm just trying to reflect upon that. Again, I'm not on a daily basis looking at our interest rates and all that borrowing. As a general principle, I'm trying to encourage us to borrow less while recognizing all those analogies we talked about, as with the mortgages and enjoying stuff now. Generally, I would like to see our spending reduced a little bit, and it's not a healthy sign if the province is getting credit downgrades. The city has also received credit downgrades recently, and we're either going to go further down, stay the same, or improve our credit rating. And I think we should be striving to improve our credit rating.
Right. I appreciate that insight. Thanks.
I have a question on, I guess, just kind of bringing a number of the things that we've discussed together. When it comes to longer term, so longer than the 4-year cycles that you alluded to, you know, 10, 20, 30 years, and, you know, there's going to be a lot of things affected by that, whether it's, you know, interest rates and the performance of some of these reserves. But in general, how does that play into, you know, daily or yearly decisions for the city?
That's a good question again. And we, as I said, we set our budget for 4-year cycles, but for our large capital spending, the amortization could be over 20, 30 years, which means if you think of this term of council, this one mayor, 12 councillors, no guarantee who will be back at the table after the next election, notwithstanding current announcements that the mayor is not running again and some other councillors aren't running. So it should be the right of a new council to really to almost have full financial freedom because they're elected based on whatever platform they ran on by Edmontonians in the moment. And they can talk about fiscal prudence or spending money now or making Edmonton compete better against Calgary, all this stuff. But past council decisions will still have that lasting impact. Right now, a lot of the debt that the city of Edmonton has occurred before my time. I've only been on council for 3 years. And then I talked about something called the operating cost of capital, which is sort of an obvious thing, but it isn't obvious if you don't stop to think about it. And I guess as an example, I would say the LRT, it's very capital intensive and it costs billions of dollars and it's seen as a good investment for the most part. But the actual operating the trains is quite expensive. And right now there's an operator on each train, and then there's a lot of security, and then there's people collecting fares, and there's janitors and custodians and all the rest. All that. And speaking to Joel's earlier comment about a city doesn't die, and I think that way very strongly when it comes to infrastructure decisions. If you're talking about LRT, is it the right technology, not just for today, but for the foreseeable future? So, and whatever routes you carve out, like, so it's important to have a land acquisition done properly. Sometimes you see like a jog in a road and it's just because historically someone didn't want to sell their property or whatever the case is. But if you think a city is going to be around for hundreds and hundreds of years, you might as well have that corridor straight. And likewise, if you're doing LRT development, you want to think for the long run, does this make the most sense? But recognizing that, well, someone's always going to have to operate the LRT. So if it costs this much per year, well, then it's going to cost that much every year, unless there's some type of economic, technological revolution. But we also have to deal with the very real issue of human resources and union politics and all that, where there's obviously desires to maintain employment, and we want to be doing that as a city. We're not just a corporation that wants to maximize profits, because we don't think about profits. We think about the social good, community standards, and the like. So, Nicholas, to your question, all our decisions have future implications. Some of it, though, can be offset by the fact that the population continues to grow, and then you get a higher tax base. But you can't always rely on that, because, as I referenced in a previous question, You could have a declining population. Think of Fort McMurray; they've shrunk. Think of, I don't know, cities in Newfoundland. A lot of them have shrunk, for example.
Yeah, thanks.
So I'm gonna kind of shift gears a little bit here, but I think it has a little bit to do with it has obviously something to do with the city budget, but you think of it as a living, breathing thing, and it's nice to hear that. Actually, I think as someone who doesn't know a lot about the way in which our politicians think, it's really great to hear that they have a forward-looking bias. So with that in mind, how does the city think about new revenue lines? I mean, every business needs to iterate. It needs to continue to grow and change. I think the one that most people are going to be able to recognize, especially with its legalization, is cannabis. How has that contributed to our budget? Has it at all? And does the current city, or at least the councillors, believe that it's going to continue to be a space that's growing?
That's a good question. I'm going to give you an answer you're not going to like too much, but then I can follow it up with an example that could tie this in a bit. So we don't get cannabis revenue as a city. That's why you're not going to like the question. The province does, or is it the federal government? The federal government does, but a lot of the licensing is done through the province. So most things that you see in a city are sort of within the municipal jurisdiction, but there's some things that aren't. Now, with cannabis, a better answer before I get to the other example is we do get business licensing money from cannabis shops like we do from all businesses. And for some reason, we decided to charge them a lot more than other businesses, perhaps because we thought it was going to be very lucrative. That hasn't exactly turned out to be the case. And a lot of these cannabis stores are actually struggling a bit. So we're getting feedback that they want to just be paying regular fees that you would for like a bank or a bakery or something else. Now, we also thought there would be higher increased costs to policing as a result of cannabis. And so we budgeted a lot more for policing, thinking like, oh, outside cannabis shops. It would sound silly now, but we thought people would be like panhandling and hanging out and social disruption and smoking marijuana on the street, even though we had a whole debate about where you can smoke that in public, which was a very interesting debate, but that's not relevant for this. But I mean, that's something we had to struggle with because it became legal. So we saved a lot of money in policing. Now, but we don't get revenue from cannabis, but we do talk a lot about revenue sharing. And we think that the province should give us a little bit more because we're downstream and we deal with the impacts of legalization, partly in policing that I mentioned, even though that wasn't as bad as we thought. Now, I don't want to deviate too much from your question, but an interesting new revenue stream that the province has made available to us is toll roads. So to pay a toll to go over something on a road. When you have so many other roads, it's hard to find a situation where, like, why would you pay a toll to say go down 97th Street when you could just take 82nd Street instead? So it doesn't always work out too well. Maybe Highway 2 between Calgary and Edmonton, but people would still try and get around it. But what I'm thinking, and this won't be politically popular, but there is talk about with bringing the LRT north, so it has to go across the CN tracks and the Yellowhead. That bridge could be done as part of the LRT construction, but then does it make sense to have a roadway for cars? And if so, how that costs an extra $100 or $200 million? Perhaps because that's a pinch point and it'd be optional to go on there. In the spirit of your question about other revenue sources, if you had a toll road there, that could justify the cost of that additional infrastructure, and then just those using the toll would, based on convenience, because there's still other routes, but if they found that to be worth their convenience, you could have a toll. Also, if you had tolls elsewhere, you could control supply and demand a little bit. If the desire is to get more people on transit from an excuse me, my throat here, from an efficiency perspective, you might want more people on transit. It's just a better public good to have people traveling that way. So if you were doing tolls, you could try and discourage private automobile use, as another example.
I don't think my fellow Sherwood Parkians are going to love this, but it's been a rumor for ever since I've lived here that we would get one on the baseline and or Y roads into the city, because we still own or South Dakota County still owns the Refinery Row assets.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and I could just see that just lighting a fire in an area that I don't want to see, because I take those roads into the city every day, but I could see it being a very lucrative space for the city of Edmonton.
I think so. Just on that, just as a quick observation that not too many people realize, in the city, we have a lot of publicly funded institutions or attractions such as the zoo or the Tellus World of Science, and we pay a lot of money for that because obviously your admittance fee doesn't get you the full cost. But when we have people from Sherwood Park and St. Albert coming into Edmonton, or the arena, don't get me started on that. That was an interesting financing mechanism that was before my time. But over $300 million of taxpayer money went to that arena. Now, there is a ticket tax and it's a bit unique, but when people from outside of Edmonton come in to enjoy that, they didn't contribute in the traditional type of way. So people in Sherwood Park, I don't know.
No comment. I very much like this situation the way it is, but I wouldn't be mad at the city if they started to encroach on some of our revenues because of how much of the infrastructure in Edmonton that we do use. So wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. I think we'll need a separate chat to talk about the Edmonton downtown arena and the money raised to fund that and how that all worked. So maybe we'll do that for our next conversation. Well, John, maybe to close things off here with one final question. This has been fantastic. A lot of very good insight into the city budget and how things work within the operating budget as well as capital side of things. Maybe just for everyone watching, if folks want to get more informed about the city budget, what would be the best place for them to do so? How can they do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this level of government is the most open to receiving public input. And by that, I mean, we have open public hearings where anyone from the public can register to speak for 5 minutes. So on one hand, you can speak in front of all of council and the mayor, and the public hearing on that is in 2 weeks from now. I don't want to be looking at my calendar when I'm talking to you on this because it doesn't make for good video, but I did so anyways. It's on December 3rd, members of the public can speak. Now, all our budget documents are also available on the city's website. Go to edmonton.ca, then / there should be meetings meetings will bring you there, and then look for the budget documents. There's thousands of pages. It's a bit intimidating, but I read it. There's a lot of information on there. We're very publicly facing. Again, I know I've contrasted a lot between other levels of government, and you haven't always asked those questions, but I want to really explain that difference because a lot of people don't know how cities work. The provincial government will meet behind closed doors with their cabinet for weeks or days, whatever it takes, and come out with a budget and then tell it to everyone. Here, we're doing it very publicly and very open. And for members and we're streaming everything on YouTube now and on the city's website. So you can watch from home, you can email all of us with your thoughts, but you can also speak at that public hearing. So it's a very open process, which makes it very different than other governments, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. No, we'll include the link to the City of Edmonton site with that document at the end of this video, this presentation. Well, with that, it's been a slice, John. Really appreciate you having making the time and speaking with us about the City of Edmonton budget. You survived our grilling of questions. So.
Yeah, and I think you guys have a really good group, and to all your viewers, you're part of something that I can tell is pretty special, and I wish I knew about it in a different life when I was maybe a bit younger. But I think what you guys have going on is really great, and it's obvious to me that you're the next generation that's going to make this city great, or Sherwood Park great, however the case may be. Thank you.
Right on. No, thanks again. Joel, Nick, any final comments from your end?
No, I think I definitely learned a few things, and hopefully a lot of the viewers will have learned a few new things as well. And yeah, appreciate the time. Thanks for giving us your insight.
No problem. Thanks.
Yeah, much appreciated.
All right. Well, that concludes our part 5 of the 5-part Fireside Chat series. John, thank you again for joining us today. And thanks for everyone watching this video. Take care.